The courthouse lobby smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant, the morning bustle echoing through marble walls. Two uniformed officers leaned casually against the metal detector, smirking as they spotted a black man walking in with a briefcase. He was dressed neatly in a tailored navy suit, polished shoes clicking on the floor. But none of that mattered. "Hey, where you think you're going?" Officer Granger drawled, his lips curling in a grin. His partner Martinez stepped in front of the man, blocking the path. "I'm here for today's docket," the man replied calmly, adjusting his tie. "Docket? That's funny. You look more like you're here for processing." Martinez slapped cuffs on his wrists before he could protest. Granger chuckled loudly, enough for bystanders to hear. "A suit and tie doesn't hide what you are. You people always trying to sneak into places you don't belong." The man's jaw tightened, but he didn't resist. The clicking of the handcuffs echoed louder than the morning chatter. A crowd of lawyers, clerks, and defendants turned their heads to watch. Some snickered, others looked away in discomfort. "Move it!" Martinez barked, shoving him forward. "Filthy animals like you belong in cells, not courthouses." The laughter stung like a whip. Yet, beneath the humiliation, there was a silence in the man's eyes. Cold, unwavering, almost prophetic. Little did they know. Within the hour, the same man they mocked, cuffed, and shoved like a criminal would sit above them, wearing the robe, wielding the gavel, and deciding their fate. What unfolded inside that courtroom would turn the sneers into silence. Every insult would boomerang back. The officers who thought they had power would discover that underestimating a black man, especially this one, was the most devastating mistake of their careers, because the man they cuffed wasn't a defendant. He wasn't a trespasser. He was Judge Malcolm Hayes, the presiding authority for the very cases those officers were sworn to testify in. And today, the law would remember his name. To understand why this moment mattered so much, you need to know who Malcolm Hayes was long before he wore the robe. Born in a modest neighborhood in Atlanta, Malcolm grew up in a world stacked against him. His father worked double shifts as a janitor at the airport. His mother juggled 2 part-time jobs while taking night classes. Money was scarce, but discipline and dignity were abundant. From a young age, Malcolm absorbed the sting of racial bias. He remembered being 12, stopped, and frisked on his way home from school because an officer thought his backpack looked suspicious. He remembered his high school debate coach warning him, "You'll have to work twice as hard, Malcolm, just to be seen as equal." So he did. Books became his armor. While friends got caught in neighborhood troubles, Malcolm buried himself in law journals, studying court cases long before he ever set foot in law school. He devoured the stories of Thurgood Marshall, Constance Baker Motley, and Charles Hamilton Houston, the giants who used law as a sword against injustice. Scholarships carried him through Morehouse, then Harvard Law. His rise wasn't easy. Professors underestimated him, internships overlooked him, and colleagues doubted him. But Malcolm's mind was sharp, relentless, and fueled by a fire that prejudice could never extinguish. By 38, he'd become one of the youngest federal judges in the state, known for his piercing intellect and uncompromising sense of justice. But despite the robe, despite the title, moments like this morning reminded him society still saw the color of his skin before the weight of his role. Back in the courthouse hallway, the humiliation deepened as the officers shoved him along. Malcolm's briefcase tumbled to the ground, spilling papers across the floor. Granger laughed, boot nudging one of the files. "Oh, what's this? Law homework?" Martinez sneered, grabbing the man by the elbow. "You think you can play dress-up and walk in here like a lawyer?" "Newsflash! You ain't fooling anybody," the crowd murmured, whispers threading through the air. Some reached for their phones, recording the scene. A black woman waiting for her hearing clenched her fists, whispering under her breath, "Lord, give him strength." Malcolm said nothing. He let them push, let them mock, Let them believe they were in control. The silence wasn't weakness. It was patience. Inside the holding room, the officers removed the cuffs with exaggerated ceremony. "Sit tight," Martinez mocked. "Judge will see you soon." The irony was razor sharp, because soon, very soon, it would be Malcolm Hayes sitting on the elevated bench, robe draped across his shoulders, while the very officers who laughed at him would be forced to address him as "Your Honor." And when the truth revealed itself, their laughter would choke in their throats. Minutes later, the courtroom filled. Lawyers shuffled papers, defendants sat nervously, and officers stationed themselves along the walls. Martinez and Granger strolled in, still smirking, certain their little lesson had put another black man in his place. The bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Malcolm Hayes." The doors opened. Silence rippled through the room as Malcolm entered, robes flowing, gavel in hand. His gaze swept across the courtroom, sharp and unflinching, until it landed directly on the two officers. Granger's jaw slackened. Martinez blinked, color draining from his face. The man they cuffed, shoved, and mocked was the judge. The same man they degraded now commanded the bench, and with it, the authority to strip them of credibility, dignity, and, if justice allowed, even freedom. Malcolm adjusted his glasses, seated himself, and tapped the gavel once. The sound echoed like a thunderclap. "You may be seated," he said, voice calm, authoritative, carrying the weight of justice itself. But for Martinez and Granger, the ground beneath them had already collapsed. The air inside the courtroom turned heavy. Every eye shifted between the bench and the officers, who suddenly looked like children caught stealing candy. Malcolm didn't flinch. His face was composed, but beneath that calm exterior burned a quiet storm. The first case of the morning was scheduled to be routine. State v. Jonathan Mills, a narcotics charge. The lead witnesses? Officers Martinez and Granger. "Mr. Prosecutor," Judge Hayes said, his voice even, "please call your first witness." The assistant district attorney rose, buttoning his suit jacket. "The state calls Officer Martinez." Martinez hesitated, throat dry. The walk to the witness stand felt like a mile. The oath administered by the bailiff echoed like a sentence. He sat, eyes darting nervously toward the bench. "Officer," the prosecutor began, "please describe the events of the arrest." Malcolm lifted a hand. "Before we begin, the court must address a preliminary matter." The entire room froze. "This morning," Malcolm continued, "two officers unlawfully detained and humiliated an officer of this court. They did so in public, without cause, and with open racial hostility." Murmurs rippled through the audience. Journalists scribbled furiously, sensing the story was no longer about Jonathan Mills, but about a systemic rot exposed in real time. "Officer Martinez," Malcolm said, his eyes piercing through the man. "Would you care to explain why you handcuffed me at the courthouse entrance?" Martinez's lips parted, but no sound came out. His face flushed crimson. "Your Honor, I thought—" "You thought," Malcolm cut in, "that because of the color of my skin, I couldn't possibly belong here. Isn't that true?" Gasps filled the courtroom. Granger shifted in his seat, sweat forming on his brow. Malcolm leaned forward slightly, his tone steady but razor-sharp. "This court cannot and will not proceed with testimony from witnesses who have shown such reckless disregard for truth and integrity. Officers whose judgment is poisoned by prejudice cannot be trusted to uphold justice." The prosecutor stammered, "Your Honor, with respect." Silence. Malcolm's gavel struck once, thunderous. This is not just about one incident. This is about the credibility of officers sworn to protect the law. And this morning, they revealed who they truly are. The defense attorney for Jonathan Mills rose quickly. "Motion to dismiss, Your Honor." on grounds that the arresting officer's credibility is irreparably compromised. Martinez looked as if he might faint. Granger muttered a curse under his breath. Malcolm nodded slowly. Motion granted. The case collapsed in a single stroke of the gavel. Jonathan Mills, who had been trembling moments earlier, blinked in disbelief as the charges were dismissed. But the true devastation wasn't for Mills. It was for the officers. Their case had crumbled, their authority publicly dismantled, their humiliation complete. The echo of consequences, word spread quickly. Reporters outside the courthouse were already broadcasting live updates. Judge Hayes dismisses case citing racial bias by arresting officers. Other defense attorneys began filing motions, citing the morning's events as proof of systemic prejudice. Martinez and Granger's names were whispered like poison through the legal halls. Inside the courtroom, Malcolm wasn't done. Let the record reflect, he said firmly, that this court will be recommending an internal affairs investigation into the conduct of officers Martinez and Granger, with full review by the Department of Justice if necessary. Racial bias is not a private failing. It is a public danger. The officers sat stiff, trapped in their own disgrace. They had entered the morning laughing, confident in their power. Now, before colleagues, defendants, lawyers, and press, they were stripped bare. But Malcolm's justice wasn't about personal revenge. He knew that true justice meant more than shaming two men. It meant exposing the system that enabled them. That afternoon, he convened an emergency session with the chief of police, the district attorney, and local civil rights leaders. Cameras captured the meeting, broadcasting it across the state. Malcolm didn't mince words. This morning's incident was not unique. It was a symptom of a disease we have tolerated too long. Officers emboldened by prejudice undermine every conviction they touch. They corrode public trust, damage lives, and dishonor their oath. He laid out directives. Every officer entering his courtroom would undergo bias training. Any officer with a substantiated history of misconduct would have their testimony flagged, cases hinging solely on such. Testimony would face immediate scrutiny. This is not optional, Malcolm declared. Justice does not bend to convenience. It demands accountability. Civil rights advocates hailed the measures as groundbreaking. For once, it seemed a judge wasn't just presiding over cases, he was reshaping the very culture of justice. The moral lesson, the moral was stark and undeniable. Authority means nothing without integrity. The laughter of two officers, rooted in arrogance and racism, had turned into the silence of shame. Malcolm's story became a parable told across communities. The danger of underestimating someone based on prejudice, the inevitability of truth rising, and the reminder that black voices, long silenced, long dismissed, carry power when they speak through the halls of justice. One journalist put it best in the evening paper. This morning, two officers tried to drag a man into a cell. By noon, that same man was dragging an entire system into the light. As the gavel fell for the final time that day, Malcolm looked across the silent courtroom. Defendants, lawyers, officers, and civilians all stared back, the weight of the moment heavy in their chests. Justice, he said softly, is not a gift. It is a right, and it is fragile. Every act of bias, every word of hate, chips away at it. But today, we remind ourselves, it can be rebuilt, stronger, fairer, for all. He rose, robe flowing behind him, leaving the courtroom in reverent silence. And outside, the world buzzed, not with laughter, but with questions. What would you do if the person you mocked turned out to hold your fate in their hands? What does it mean to live in a society where prejudice can collapse an entire case? And how many more stories like Malcolm Hayes's remain untold? By evening, the courthouse steps were packed with cameras, microphones, and curious onlookers. News trucks lined the streets. Headlines spread like wildfire. Black judge exposes racist officers in live. Courtroom drama. Laughter turns to silence as cuffed man takes the bench. Justice served in real time. Prejudice meets its reckoning. Clips of the gavel striking, of Martinez squirming under questioning, of Malcolm declaring, "Justice does not bend to convenience," replayed on every station. On social media, hashtags trended. Black voices speak. Racial injustice. Judge Hayes. For Malcolm, however, the spotlight wasn't the goal. He returned to his chambers quietly, placing his robe on the stand with the care of a man laying down armor after battle. He thought of his parents, his father, who once marched for civil rights, and his mother, who worked 3 jobs so he could study law. Their voices, their sacrifices echoed in his mind. "They cuffed me today," he whispered to the empty room. "But tomorrow, they'll think twice before cuffing another man without cause." The officers, seats. Fall Martinez and Granger's humiliation wasn't confined to the courtroom. The police chief announced an internal affairs probe within hours. Community leaders demanded suspension. Civil rights lawyers lined up plaintiffs for class action suits, citing patterns of racial bias linked to the 2 officers. At home, Martinez faced his teenage son, who had seen the viral clip online. "Dad," the boy said quietly, "why would you do that? Why would you laugh?" Granger, meanwhile, found his desk cleared the next morning. Administrative leave pending investigation. He shouted, slammed doors, cursed the witch hunt, but deep down, the weight of exposure gnawed at him. The men who once strutted with unchecked arrogance now walked with slumped shoulders, haunted by the truth finally dragged into daylight. A community's voice. For many in the city, Malcolm's stand became more than a single event. It was a mirror. Churches held forums. Schools hosted discussions. Local radio buzzed with callers. "My brother got cuffed for nothing. I wish he had a Judge Hayes in his corner." They finally saw what we live every day. It's not paranoia, it's reality. Community leaders used the momentum to demand reforms. Calls grew louder for independent oversight boards, for mandatory body cameras, for federal audits of police conduct. Malcolm's case had become a rallying point, proof that silence could be broken, that black voices could speak and be heard. Malcolm's reflection late one night. Malcolm sat in his study, surrounded by books and quiet. He looked at a framed photo of himself as a law student, younger, thinner, eyes still raw with determination. Back then, professors warned him, "You'll have to be twice as good to get half the respect." He had nodded, not yet knowing how cruelly true it was. And yet, here he was, a judge, a voice, a symbol, but he didn't feel triumphant. He felt the burden of every unseen case, every silenced voice, every person who never got the chance to reveal who they truly were. "They cuffed me today," he thought, "but they cuffed countless others before me, and most didn't have a bench to sit on." Step 7. Extended. Systemic change. Malcolm used his platform carefully, strategically. He worked with the City Council to launch the Equity in Justice Initiative, a program requiring every officer's disciplinary history to be public record in court. He partnered with law schools to create mentorship, pipelines for black students, ensuring more judges, lawyers, and prosecutors of color would rise. He ordered a review of past cases where Martinez and Granger testified. Dozens of convictions came under scrutiny. Some were overturned. Men and women walked free, their lives no longer shackled by the lies of prejudiced officers. And through it all, Malcolm insisted on transparency. "This is not about one man," he told a gathering of reporters. "It is about a culture that thrives in shadows. Today, we open the blinds." The larger moral, the story wasn't just about humiliation reversed. It was about the fragility and strength of justice. Fragile, because prejudice in a uniform could collapse it with a single laugh. Strong, because a man once underestimated could rise and reshape the system itself. Parents told their children Malcolm's story as a parable. Never let someone else's bias define your worth. And never doubt that truth has a way of silencing even the loudest mockery. Closing scene. The courthouse was quieter the next week. No reporters, no flashing lights, just the steady rhythm of justice. Malcolm entered through the same front doors where Martinez and Granger had cuffed him. The security guard who once smirked now nodded respectfully. The crowd that once gawked now whispered in reverence. He paused at the steps, looking out at the city skyline. Justice, he murmured, isn't loud. It's steady, and it never forgets. Then he stepped inside, robe over his arm, ready for the next case. Because justice wasn't about one dramatic morning, it was about the countless mornings that followed, where prejudice would be tested, and truth demanded its voice. And in those halls, black voices would always speak. The final engagement. Hook, now the question turns to you. What would you have done if you saw officers laughing as they cuffed a man who didn't deserve it? Have you, or someone you know, ever been judged unfairly just for the color of your skin? Your story matters. Share it in the comments. Raise your voice. Because when black voices speak, the world has no choice but to listen. So don't stay silent. Watch, like, comment, and subscribe for more stories of truth, justice, and the fight against prejudice. Together, we carry these voices forward, and we make sure laughter never drowns out dignity again.